Okay, guys, I am going to try to go through this quickly. It's the quick recap of the second book of Samuel from chapters 1 to chapters 24. So please be patient with me as I go through these chapters. I'm not going to read the whole chapter again, but I am just going to pull one point or two, maybe three, from each chapter just to review and recap what we went over in each chapter. We have two exciting books that we are heading into after this review, and I am so excited about it. So let's get through this review before we move on. Second book of Samuel, in chapters 1, David mourned for Saul and Jonathan. An Amalekite, wanting some recognition, lied and told David how he killed Saul to end his suffering. David got really upset because he respected Saul as the Lord's anointed, so he killed the Amalekite and continued his lament for Saul and Jonathan, his best friend. In 2 Samuel chapter 2, David had already been anointed as king, but Abner, Saul's mighty general of his army, was looking out for Saul's family, and he quickly moved Ishbosheth, Saul's son, into the position as king over many of the tribes of Israel. David, on the other hand, he had moved to Hebron and was crowned king over Judah. So there were two kings over the tribes of Israel. Then Joab, who was David's friend and the general of his army, he got together with Abner, Saul's general of Saul's army, and they brought their two armies together to fight, and Abner killed Joab's brother. In 2 Samuel chapter 3, after having a falling out with Saul's son Ishbosheth, Abner and his forces joined David's side. Mm, mm, mm. Joab, still holding animosity and anger against Abner for killing his brother, he avenged his brother's death by killing Abner. David then mourned for Abner, and he established his own innocence of the crime. 2 Samuel chapter 4, Rechab and Baanah, they secretly murdered Ishbosheth, Saul's son, to put an end to his reign and take him out of the position of king over the tribes of Israel. Then, thinking that David would be happy about their deed, they told David, and he had them both put to death. Ishbosheth's head was buried in Abner's grave. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, all the tribes anointed David as king over Israel. And then David captures Jerusalem from the Jebusites and make it his stronghold. He then went to war and was victorious over the Philistines who had assembled against him. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, as David was bringing the ark back to Jerusalem, the path that it was traveling on was rough and rocky. So it began to rock as if it was going to fall, and Uzzah, the priest, reached out to save it from falling, and God killed Uzzah for touching the ark. David then, being afraid, halted the transport of the ark. And then after 3 months, David eventually transferred the ark to Jerusalem amidst a spectacular celebration where he was dancing. After rebuking David for his foolish dancing, Michal was punished by God with barrenness. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, David expressed his desire to build a temple for God. Although God rejected David's request, he promised David that his family will continue to reign forever. David then prayed to God and asked him to uphold his promise. In 2 Samuel chapter 8, King David, as the mighty warrior that he was, went out to battle and is victorious over the Philistines, the Moabites, the Arameans, the Edomites, and the king of Zobah. David began acquiring great wealth and ruled his kingdom righteously. The men who were his leaders were also blessed. In 2 Samuel chapter 9, David, in keeping his promise to his longtime friend Jonathan, wished to honor one of his descendants. So he found his son Mephibosheth and gave him land and servants and made him eat at his table in Jerusalem. In 2 Samuel chapter 10, David sent his courier with message of support and condolence and sympathy to the king's son of Ammon. The king of Ammon had died, and his son was now in reign. And the king of Ammon was very kind to David. So David, in return, was sending condolences to his son, who is now king. Instead of accepting the message, he publicly humiliated King David's men. King David then assembled his army and fought and won over the Ammonites and the Armenian armies. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, David lusted and impregnated a married woman named Bathsheba. Then he attempted to cover up the pregnancy by trying to convince Uriah, her husband, to go home and sleep with her or have sex with her. Bathsheba's husband did not go home at all to sleep with his wife. He refused to do so because he was thinking about the other soldiers that were on the battlefield, and he was called from the battlefield and he wanted to go back and fight with his brethren. So David then had him killed and took Bathsheba as his own wife. 2 Samuel chapter 12, Nathan the prophet condemned David by telling him a parable and moreover prophesied about his upcoming family difficulties. David and Bathsheba's son died, but the two of them had another son, and they named him Solomon. David's great captain of his army then conquered the Ammonite capital. In 2 Samuel chapter 13, Amnon, David's son, raped his own sister Tamar. Absalom, David's son, killed his brother Amnon and fled from his father David. In 2 Samuel chapter 14, after pardoning a man for killing his own brother, David decided to forgive Absalom for killing Amnon. Absalom then is brought to Jerusalem to meet with David, his father. In 2 Samuel chapter 15, Absalom led a revolt and forced David, his father, to flee for his life to Jerusalem. David then sent spies to Jerusalem. In 2 Samuel chapter 16, Ziba supported David and accused Mephibosheth of treason. David's showed restraint when Shimei hurled curses at David and threw stones at him. Then Absalom slept with David's concubine that he left in Jerusalem. Mm, mm, mm. In 2 Samuel chapter 17, Hushai delayed Ahithophel's attack on David, and David escaped. And Ahithophel was upset because his advice was ignored, so he committed suicide. David and Absalom, his son, their, their armies prepared for battle. In 2 Samuel chapter 18, David's army rounded up Absalom's forces, and Absalom got caught, tangled in a tree by his long hair, and is killed by Joab. Then the messengers went and told David about the battle and also the death of his son Absalom. In 2 Samuel chapter 19, David wept and mourned for his son. He made his way back to Jerusalem and pardoned those who wronged him and honored those who honored him. In 2 Samuel chapter 20, Sheba, in 2 Samuel chapter 20, Sheba led the Israelites away from David. Joab then pursued Sheba and besieged him in the city of Abel. The siege ended when Joab was given Sheba's head off of his body. In 2 Samuel chapter 21, a deal with the Gibeonites. David made a deal with the Gibeonites. So Saul's descendants are killed by the Gibeonites. After a close call in battle, David retired from the military, and his men defeated many Philistine warriors. In 2 Samuel chapter 22, David sang a song of thanksgiving and a song of praise unto the Lord, praising Yahweh for saving him from his enemies. In 2 Samuel chapter 23, David relates a message that he received from God, and David's warriors and their military exploits are numbered. In 2 Samuel chapter 24, David took a census of the people. God was enraged. David repented, and God sent Gad, the prophet Gad, to give David options for his punishment. David did not want to fall into the hands of his own fellow man. So he decided that he would take the punishment from God that God chose, because God had more mercy. So God was enraged, and he killed 70,000 Israelites with a plague. David then appeased God with burnt offerings, burnt sacrifices, and God stopped the plague. Thus ends the reading of the review of the second book of Samuel. Thank you again for joining me on this journey in the second book of Samuel, and I hope that you'll go back into this book, study, meditate on it, and let the Holy Spirit feed us from this book and the previous books what he wants us to know, so that we could grow in him and we could establish spiritual growth and maturity in God. Stay blessed, everybody. I'll see you around. We are headed to the first book of Kings.